This video is sponsored by Stack Audio, manufacturers of the Orva speaker and equipment isolation feet used by a British audiophile. For more information about these and other products, please click the link in the description. If you're watching this video within a few days of its publication, you may not be aware that Monitor Audio launched a new speaker on the 1st of July. I was fortunate enough to have one in pre-launch, but I had to keep it under wraps even from my Patreons until the embargo was lifted. The new Studio 89 speaker draws inspiration from the first Monitor Audio product to bear the Studio name, the Studio 15, launched 35 years ago. It was the first Monitor Audio speaker to incorporate technologies that are now synonymous with the brand: metal dome tweeters and metal cone drivers. One look at the new speakers and you can see that there aren't many similarities between the old model and the new one beyond the gloss black finish and anodized gold drivers. But the new Studio 89 takes its name from the launch date of the original Studio 15. I've been very impressed with Monitor Audio speakers I've reviewed thus far. The Silver 50s last year won my prize for the best speakers of the year in the sub £1,000 category, and presently the Silver 100s are occupying pole position to do the same this year. But the Studio 89s are not based on the Silver series, not even the Gold series. They have trickle-down technology from the Platinum 3G series and the £70,000 flagship Hyphen speaker. So, how did I get on with these? The Monitor Audio Studio 89s retail for £1,999 in the UK. I'd recommend that most people go for the optional £500 die-cast aluminium stands, not just for aesthetic appeal. They're well constructed, have wide outrigger feet, a mass fillable central column, and an appropriately sized top plate to which the speaker can be bolted. I stuck with my Target R4 stands for the purposes of the review, as they're even more substantial. I like the look of the Studio 89s. The satin drivers and logo are finished in an antique gold colour that's understated enough to provide a nice contrast to the piano black cabinet without being in your face. They're a nightmare to photograph, so I'd urge you to look at them in the flesh to assess their aesthetic appeal. The Studio 89s measure 340mm high, 361mm deep, and a mere 157mm wide. That's 13.4 by 14.2 by 6.2 inches, weighing 7.6 kilograms or 16.8 pounds. The new Monitor Audio speakers are a Diapolito design, or MTM as it's commonly known. Centrally located behind a honeycomb grille is an air motion transformer. Sitting above and below are two identical 108mm 4¼ inch C-cam mid-woofers. There's quite a bit of tech involved, which I'll get into later. Monitor Audio love their acronyms. The two slotted ports are termed Hive, which I suspect is an abbreviation for high velocity. In any case, there are some laminations to the surface to reduce turbulence and port chuffing noises. Mounted to an anodized gold faceplate are one set of very high quality speaker binding posts, chunky and rhodium plated. In fact, they're taken straight out the 70 grand Hyphen speakers. Before I get into the specifics of the technology employed by the Studio 89s, I want to explain a little bit about the pros and cons of an MTM design. It's called a Diapolito array after the engineer who first developed it. Joseph Diapolito was trying to find a solution to the inherent lobe tilting problem of traditional loudspeakers, where the tweeter is usually mounted above, but sometimes mounted below the mid-range unit. Acoustic lobing is caused by two drivers, for example a tweeter and a mid-range unit, producing the same frequencies around the crossover region. Due to the differences in size between the two drivers, their dispersion characteristics aren't the same, and due to them being in two different physical locations, the time it takes for the signal to arrive at your ears isn't the same either. The result is a radiation pattern that isn't ideal. One solution is to time align the drivers. This is normally done to some extent in the crossover by delaying the signal from the tweeter, but to electrically time align across all frequencies is nigh on impossible. Another solution is to geometrically time align by creating a baffle step compensation physically rather than electrically, as 3 Square Audio have done with the Ayals that I reviewed, but the quirky looks aren't going to appeal to everyone. Joseph Diapolito did it with his MTM array. The result was a much better on-axis radiation pattern, But to ensure that the off-axis performance didn't go to pop, he did two things. First was to keep the midwoofer size as small as possible, and that's why you won't see many MTM arrays with midwoofers bigger than 4.5 inches. And the second was to use high order crossovers, typically third order slopes with an 18 dB per octave roll-off. And that ensured that the dispersion pattern of the drivers was as closely matched as possible. Right, time to take a look at this Diapolito array. Surprise, surprise, the midwoofers are 4.25 inches in diameter, crossing over at 2400 Hz to the tweeter using third order crossovers. Some premium parts are used in the crossover, including polypropylene capacitors, iron core inductors, apart from the big one on the midwoofer. The midwoofer cone uses their RDT or rigid diaphragm technology, now in its third incarnation. It's what you find on their current Platinum series and Hyphen flagship. The CCAM or ceramic coated aluminium magnesium outer skin sits over a Nomex honeycomb central core with a woven carbon fiber underskin, lightness and stiffness being the goal. I have another acronym for you, MPD. It stands for micro pleated diaphragm. Why they can't call it AMT eludes me, because the tweeter is an air motion transformer. I guess if you develop your own drivers, you're entitled to call them what you like. It extends out to 60,000 Hz, so it's super fast, and there's plenty of headroom on top. The MTM array is mounted to a die-cast aluminium front panel for rigidity, and then isolated from the cabinet by a gasket. Two through-hole bolts clamp the rear baffle to the front assembly, compressing the cabinet and effectively providing additional bracing. Interesting stuff. This is my first review of a Diapolito design. So how do the Studio 89 sound? After how well the Monitor Audio Silver 50s and 100s performed, I wasn't going to turn down the opportunity to review a brand new to market monitor audio speaker, especially one based on trickle-down technology from the Platinum 3G series, but for less than half the price than the cheapest speaker in that range. My preconceptions were that these speakers may struggle a bit though, and that's because monitor audio speakers have a bit of a reputation for sounding bright, and even though the Silver 50s and Silver 100s have stunning levels of resolution, they are a touch bright. It's a characteristic that can be compensated for with partnering equipment to some extent, but more importantly, it's understandable on speakers that retail for less than $1,000 that they aren't going to deliver all things in all areas. My expectations from $2,000 speakers are higher, and it turns out I needn't have been concerned. These are not bright sounding speakers, and the levels of detail and refinement from the Studio 89s are in a different class to the Silver series. I think Studio is an appropriate name because the 89s give you the impression that they're being faithful to the recording. Play something warm and it sounds warm, play something cool and it sounds cool, and that's the only way I know to judge tonal neutrality without being present at the recording itself. The soundstage that the Studio 89s throw out is huge and uber precise. It's not only wide and deep, but easy to place the higher performers as well. This is only really possible with speakers that have an exquisite sense of timing. There are only a couple of sets of speakers that I've encountered sub £3,000 that have this level of precision. The neat Petite classics are the first ones that come to mind. I'm not guessing whether they do a better disappearing act than the Studio 89s. The reality is that both are excellent. I did note back in November 2022 that the neat Petite classics had a little discontinuity between the two drivers, with the tweeter running a little hot. All I can say is that I have no such concerns with the Studio 89s. These are punchy little speakers. The bass that is produced is extremely articulate and with decent weight given the size of the Studio 89s, but there's limited extension. Officially, the -6 dB point is quoted as 48 Hz in room. So realistically, many people would benefit from adding a subwoofer. I got excellent results by augmenting the bass with my Earl T7X. When subtly integrated, I was able to access the notes produced by the bottom register of a double bass that eluded the Studio 89s on their own. Above the bottom octave, the amount of detail that the Monitor Audios produce is extraordinary, with one caveat which I'll get to later. The mid-range transients have an attack that is crisp but not overly etched, and if there's another pair of speakers below £2,000 where the notes decay into such a dark background, I can't recall what they may be. In their attack and decay, the Studio 89s even surpass the excellent Quad Revela ones that are currently my reference sub £3,000 speakers, but for a truly natural presentation, the middle part of the note, known as the body or release, must have appropriate acoustic mass. This is where the Revela ones have it over the Studio 89s. Words like cool, dry or analytical wouldn't be appropriate to describe the monitor audio's tonal characteristics, but there still remains a touch of leanness to their presentation. Now for that caveat that I spoke about earlier. All this that I've described about the Studio 89 sound is true for 90% of the music that I listen to, whether it be soul, jazz, blues, vocal-centric, acoustic, even classic rock, but it isn't true when it comes to hard rock or big orchestral pieces. When dealing with heavy crescendos or phonetic dynamic swings, the Studio 89s fall off their pedestal from being exceptional performers to something above average. This trait is present even at moderate average listening levels of circa 80 decibels. It's something I'm going to term small speakeritis. That's a new one for you. Large speakers being able to deal with dynamic swings better isn't rocket science, it's just basic physics. But when you start to push busy tracks through the Studio 89s, they start to sound like mini monitors. Two 4¼ drivers may have the equivalent cone surface area of a 6-inch driver, but they don't seem to deal with dynamic swings like a 6-inch driver. They seem to deal with dynamic swings like two 4¼ drivers. As a result, my Amphion Argon 1s, which are outclassed by the Studio 89s in terms of clarity, soundstage and imaging, with most tracks, get their own back when things get motoring. There's a little less dynamic compression from its single 133mm 5¼ mid-woofer. It's a shame that these speakers that are class-defining in so many ways have this one notable limitation. I'd love to see a 3-way compact floor-standing version where the MTM array is liberated from bass duties by having a separate driver take care of low frequencies. What a speaker that could be. But I don't work for Monitor Audio, nor am I a speaker designer. I don't think it's placebo effect, but I did have in mind that the Studio 89s are most likely to sound best listening on axes. Being a Diaplito design, they do favour on-axis performance over off-axis. Coincidentally, I did wind up with the tweeters pointing directly at my ears, both in terms of height and toe-in angle, but I didn't think they were more sensitive to this particular type of setup and positioning than traditional tweeter mid-woofer designs. What was more critical was how close the Studio 89s were to the walls behind them, but I suspect this has nothing to do with the MTM array, more to do with the interaction of the twin slotted ports and the boundaries around them. I maintain a minimum distance of 90 centimeters or 3 feet, measured from the center line of the front baffle to the walls around them to ensure that early reflections had an appropriate delay, but also the speakers were a little bit further set back by about 15 centimeters or half a foot than a lot of two-ways find themselves in my room. And that ensured that they had the right bass reinforcement, but it didn't affect soundstage and imaging. The distance I was from the speakers, the distance from the speakers to the listening position was also critical. That is the reputation of Diaplito designs. Tonal variations are more obvious as you change the listening position relative to the speakers than a lot of traditional two-way types of speakers. So I maintained a minimum distance of 2.4 meters or 8 feet. They're a lot less fussy about partnering equipment though. My Exposure 2510 was an ideal starting point, articulate, with a lovely sense of timing and a reasonable ability to exercise control. This combination highlighted the best qualities of the Exposure amplifier. My Willsenton R8 is currently running replica vintage Philips EL34s from PS Vane on the output stage. It softened the edges but added a richness that allowed me to immerse myself in many of my favourite recordings in a way that eluded solid-state amplification. If I had to choose a solid-state amplifier to live with the Studio 89s on a long-term basis, the Hagel H190 would be it. It may not have the fullness of the R8 or the charm of the 2510, but the extra clarity, control and ability to open up the soundstage demonstrated how well the Studio 89s scale up. Monitor Audio have produced a speaker which comes very close to being a supremely capable studio monitor, although its high quality, aesthetically pleasing piano black and satin gold clothing betrays their intent that the Studio 89s are squarely aimed at the domestic market. A little bit of care needs to be taken with setup, but they aren't particularly demanding of partnering equipment. Just make sure the electronics are able to show off their strength. They are the most detailed and exquisitely timing speakers I've heard thus far for $2,000, with all bar the most energetic music, but that caveat is enough for me to pull them back from my top award. The Monitor Audio Studio 89s get a very highly recommended from this channel. I talked about the Diapolito design today, and my question for today is there a particular type of speaker design that you gravitate to, and if so, why? Please share that in the comment section. I'm sure you know what to do by now. If you want to support me here and what I do, like, share, subscribe, hit the bell notification. Check me out on Patreon. There's a couple of consultancy tiers you can access there if you think I can help you on your audiophile journey. Also, check out the ABA Club on Patreon for some great ways to interact with me and other Patreons. But for today, for now, a British audiophile signing off.